Consideration. We also have to look at enforceability. So that means you might actually have a contract, but is it legally enforceable? That's a different question to whether you actually have a contract in place. We're going to concentrate on the issue of consent, but you should be aware that there are other issues of enforceability like we have in this slide here. So consent is whether or not you willingly entered into the contract on your own. That's different from capacity, which is whether you had the ability to enter the contract, which is different again from legality. So legality is about whether the subject matter of the contract was legal or the way you carry out the contract was legal, and that's different from formality. Some contracts require some things to be done a certain way for it to be enforceable. So for instance, some contracts need to be in writing if they're going to be enforceable. Dealings in land, for instance, need to be in writing under certain acts. So formality is the form. Legality is about whether it's legal to do what you're going to do in the contract. Capacity is whether you actually had an ability to enter the contract, and we're going to concentrate on consent, which is whether the parties willingly entered into the contract. So we're going to concentrate on consent. So as I've said, you can have offer, acceptance, intent and consideration, but still not have an enforceable contract if the parties haven't willingly entered into that contract. So it goes to the point of, well, is there some reason there shouldn't be a contract? Has someone done something dodgy or wrong around this contract? And not only dodgy or wrong, it can also be, was there just not that meeting of minds that we actually thought? So it is about the meeting of minds, and it's about that meeting of minds happened free of any form of undue influence or impropriety from people. So it is about that meeting of minds that's necessary for a contract. As part of this, we are going to be concentrating not on each area. We're not going to deal with unfairness in any great detail. Instead, we're going to look at mistake, duress, undue influence, unconscionability, and misrepresentation. Let's have a look at those. When we're talking about mistake, it's not really about one party making a mistake when they contract. Normally, that wouldn't allow you to end the contract. What it has to deal with is where the mistake involved is so large that it means that we probably didn't have a contract. And we'll deal with three kinds of mistakes where that can happen: a unilateral mistake, a common mistake, and a mutual mistake. So as well as mistakes, we have to deal with duress. So duress happens where someone threatens harm, such as physical violence, to enter into a contract. So if you have duress, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a contract. It means it's voidable by the party who was under duress. So if the party who is subject to the threat of harm wants the contract to keep going, it can keep going, but they have the ability to void it, so the contract is actually voidable. Undue influence is a little bit different to duress. When we have undue influence, what we're really dealing with is a situation where we have two parties and they have a pre-existing relationship. And so one of those parties really trusts the other one or has influence over them. Now, when they use that influence in the wrong way to induce the person to enter a contract, that's when we get into the idea of undue influence. So we need that pre-existing relationship. Notice how it's different from duress. When we're talking about duress, we're far more talking about, threatening someone. This is about they trust you and you take advantage of that trust. Unconscionability is a bit different again. So in unconscionability, we have one person taking advantage of another, but rather than there being a pre-existing relationship, which is undue influence and taking advantage of that special trust or the influence that they had, in this instance with unconscionability, one party knows about the special weakness of another and they take advantage of that weakness in the other. And then what we say is their conduct was unconscionable. Okay? It was just so unfair, we couldn't allow that to stand as a contract. Finally, we'll talk about representation. We're going to talk about legislation that we have in place later in the course for that, but we'll mention it on the way through. So they're the different ways that we might end up without that willingness that's necessary for a contract. That willingness might not be there due to mistake, that there was such a grave mistake about the nature of the contract that there really wasn't a willingness, a meeting of minds that's necessary. That there was duress, that there was the threat of harm which forced the other person to enter the contract. That there was undue influence, that someone took advantage of a special relationship that they had to induce the other person to enter the contract. That there was unconscionable conduct, that you knew about a special disadvantage someone had and that you used that to induce them to enter the contract. And finally, misrepresentation prior to the contract. So we're going to go through those in more detail.